The Huldudati, an original short story by Joe B. Narrated by Joe B. A small brick house, quite overgrown by ivy, had seemed abandoned across the street from the Halverson house. Susan Halverson always cautioned her children to stay clear of the house. She did not know who owned it or how long it had been abandoned, but someone was paying for the lawn care, and the house looked well maintained, although she never saw lights on in the house. One day, a woman with a clipboard was walking around the house taking notes from time to time, taking photos from time to time. The woman went back to her car and sat inside with the door open for several minutes. Sarah felt curious. Her children were at school, her husband was at work, and she'd been planting petunias in her yard when she noticed the activity across the street. She took off her gardening gloves, quickly inspected her hands, and walked across the street, anxious to get some kind of story regarding the house. "Excuse me," she politely called out as she neared the car. She heard a voice and realized the woman was on the phone. "I'm sorry to bother you. I live across the street, and I was just curious about this house," she quickly explained, as a young professional woman's face appeared from inside the car. "I'll call you right back," the woman said, and quickly stood up, exiting the vehicle. "Betsy Hammond," she introduced herself, quickly shaking Susan's hand. "Prince Real Estate. I just sold this house." Susan breathed a sigh of relief. My goodness, that's a relief. It's spooky living next to an empty house. Are there going to be any children moving in? No, the realtor smiled. The woman who bought the house is a retired singer and actress, and lives alone, I believe. An actress? Who is she? Do I know her? Susan excitedly stammered. I don't think so, Betsy replied, checking her watch. I think she's from Europe. I know she still does background singing for commercials. That's all I know, I'm afraid. Betsy apologized as she had a busy schedule. Susan backed away from the home and allowed Betsy to drive off. She was excited to see the old house come alive. She wondered how long she would have to wait to meet her new neighbor. Weeks passed. The yard was still regularly cared for by a crew that arrived about 3 times a month. Suddenly newspapers began to appear in the driveway. Susan knew her neighbor would be moving in soon. One night, in July, as she was pulling her youngest out of the tub and wrapping him in a giant towel, she heard her husband called out, "Someone's moving in your mystery house." "Really?" Susan called back, checking her son's ears and toes as she carried him to their bedroom. There was lightning and storm approaching, so she would allow him to sleep with them for a bit. Once he was asleep, she would carry him back to his own bed. She dressed him in pajamas as her husband peeked through the curtain. It's a woman. She doesn't seem to have much stuff. The truck is small and there's only 2 guys carrying in everything. There's about a dozen boxes, a couple of tables, a nice sofa. It looks like 2 lamps. "Stop spying!" Susan shouted at him, laughing a little. Her son also giggled. Her husband walked over smiling and showed his son 3 books he'd been holding. "What's it going to be, son? Harry Goes to the Zoo? The Turtle Detective? Or another chapter from the Lives of the Saints?" The boy giggled as he considered the choices. Thunder boomed in the distance. It was a bad storm that night. It was still raining when she kissed the boys as they ran outside to catch the school bus. She would wait until the rain stopped to go over and introduce herself. She wondered if she had the ingredients for apple pie. Maybe she'd make oatmeal raisin cookies instead. The boys and her husband would like that. If she made a pie and took it over to the house would smell like pie, and she would have none for her family. She knew she didn't have enough apples for 2 pies. She hated driving when the streets were wet. Sarah Tryggvason had been tired upon her arrival. She left the boxes in the living room and opened them one at a time. Then she would take the contents to the appropriate room. Small appliances and cookware were piled in the kitchen on a counter. Glasses and dishes were piled on a different counter. Clothes were carried upstairs and left on the floor beside the bed. She carried 1 lamp upstairs and plugged it in, checking it if the light bulb was good. She set the other lamp up in the corner of the living room and switched it on, smiling at the light as the lightning lit up her room for a moment. She stared off at the window, lost in thought, until the thunder gently rolled and shook her house. She then slapped her thighs and stood up, walked over and began moving boxes purposefully until she found it. She gently lifted the box and set it carefully on the sofa. Then she went into the kitchen to fetch a knife. She cut the tape on the box and opened it slowly. She then sat down on the sofa beside the box and looked into it with her hands on her lap. She then froze her position, closed her eyes, and began to slowly sing a hymn in her native language. She then stopped and reached into the box, pulled out an oddly shaped little house, painted green and red, with yellow spots that looked as if they'd been splashed accidentally onto the back and side of the house. But the roof was shiny white, as if plastic or porcelain. She carried it over to the mantel above her fireplace and slowly lifted herself and looked into the open doorway and window of the tiny house. She looked inside, moving a bit, so that she would get a little bit more of the light from her lamp. She could see a table and a tiny bench inside. Things seemed neat and tidy. She breathed a sigh of relief. Her shoulders relaxed a little. "Here we are, my little Huldudati. I think you will like our little home." She heard the cat meowing and walked backwards slowly to the kitchen, watching the little house carefully. She pulled up a couple of plastic bags and set them on the counter. Then she turned away. The cat walked over to her, meowing loudly. She spoke to the cat, and the sound of cat food being poured into a plastic bowl was heard. She then ran some water in the sink and began to wash some dishes, opening cabinets and closing them, as she began to choose what should go where. She was tired, and she would be going to bed soon. A shadow moved inside the little house. There was movement behind the doorway. A tiny hand appeared at the doorway, and two little eyes. The eyes blinked, and then began to fade back into the darkness of the little house. A bench could be heard sliding, and then the little table. A light appeared for a moment inside the tiny house. It grew brighter and brighter. The interior of the house was dark green, and the dark green light began to shine into the living room. The little house then shook for an instant, and the light went out, and all was dark and quiet as before. Sarah knelt and talked to the cat for a bit. Then she walked back into the living room. She stopped. She sniffed the air. Did she smell smoke? She looked at the tiny little house with a worried expression, and then quickly lifted and moved a couple of boxes. She found the one she was looking for, and with a quick glance back at the tiny house, quickly ascended the stairs. About 30 minutes later, after all movement had stopped upstairs, lightning boomed outside, and rain lashed the windows. A nearby bolt of lightning illuminated the tiny house and a tiny figure standing at the doorway. It was the figure of a tiny man, well proportioned, wearing a tiny metal helmet and a metal chest piece, with long, rough leather jacket underneath and high leather riding boots, revealing some kind of black leggings underneath. He was holding a staff in his hand, and he walked the length of the mantel, studying the layout of the living room. He made a faint whistling sound, and the cat came leaping over. He jumped off the edge of the mantel and landed on the cat. He held the cat by the fur around the neck, and the cat obediently allowed him to ride as she walked this way and that, jumping into a window and allowing him to watch the outside for a moment. He got off the cat when he was in the windows, and he would touch the staff to the bottom corners of the window. He closed his eyes and uttered a few words almost silently, and then a green light shone at the end of his staff for an instant, and then disappeared. Long after he left, green spots would glow and then disappear wherever he touched his staff to the wood, looking very similar to lights from a firefly. For a few seconds, whenever he made this utterance, and after he walked away, the light would be bright, and then it would disappear and blink back again, dimmer and dimmer, until it was invisible again. He did this to all the doorways and windows the cat could reach, especially focusing on the kitchen door leading to the backyard. He lingered there for a time, making even the cat a little anxious. And then he started to go upstairs. He stopped the cat on the 7th step, and then he got off, and he touched his staff all over the 7th stair, so the 7th stair looked like a small universe of brightly glowing green spots. And then he had the cat taken back to his house. The cat could not jump to the mantel, so he pulled the hair on the cat's neck, steering him back over to the sofa. The cat jumped onto the sofa and then walked to the edge and then understood what he wanted her to do. She easily jumped from the back of the sofa to the mantel. He dismounted and went into the little house. The cat cleaned herself for a bit and then considered the sofa a better resting spot and jumped down. As the cat began to go to sleep, something distracted her, and she looked up at the house to see a green light beginning to glow again in the little house. A shadow was moving inside. The light grew very bright again, and then blackness, and stillness, and silence. Thunder boomed in the distance. The storm was passing.